Kia ora koutou. Welcome to HR Chats with me, Terada. It has been a while since we've chatted, but no surprise at the start of 2025 that we're going to be looking at diversity and inclusion, and indeed the backlash in Aotearoa. What can HR practitioners do, and what should they be aware of in their organisation? It's only been a matter of time since we discussed this. Many organisations for years here in Aotearoa have been working to ensure fair, equitable and inclusive cultures that enable people to thrive and perform at their best, not just because people are important, but because the knock-on effect ensures a financially strong and innovative business. However, now that we have a global change with the Trump regime stance on DEI, will that water down things here? What about the gains that are made? And have we seen, as we have, local politicians now calling for the removal of some DEI requirements from, amongst other things, the public service? It is a fraught time. No one better to chat with than Lisa Mulligan. Lisa is the founder and CEO of the Culture Ministry, which offers pragmatic and experienced diversity and inclusion consultancy. Bringing over 25 years' experience in human resource leadership, organisational change and development, and diversity and inclusion in multinational businesses. She works with CEOs and leadership teams to build financially and, well, inclusive businesses across Australia, New Zealand, Asia, and Europe. Kia ora, Lisa.
Kia ora. Great to be here today.
Is it though, Lisa? Is it though?
Well, I'm hoping to reassure people, I guess, that even though some of the things that are happening in the US, perhaps things aren't as bad here in Aotearoa.
Look, we're seeing those stories come out daily out of the US around that DEI backlash created under that Trump presidency.
Yep.
Are we seeing the same kind of backlash here? I've certainly seen politicians talking about it.
Look, look, I would say yes and no. I would say that Trump has certainly put DEI work on the world stage, which is a good thing, mostly. But he's certainly, I guess, giving the work a bad name. And when I was thinking about this, because people ask me all the time, like, do you actually think we're seeing DNI backlash here in New Zealand and in other parts of the world? And I think I would say yes and no. And the no is, I think in New Zealand, we do have a real value around people, around caring for people, kindness for people. We've seen that in events, for example, in the Christchurch mosque shootings. I wasn't living in New Zealand then, and when I looked into in New Zealand, the outpouring of care and kindness for those people involved was incredible. And as you said in the intro, we've got lots of organisations who are doing fantastic work in this space. So, that's a real positive. But also, as you said, there is the other side of the coin. We've got some politicians who Trump has almost given permission to come out and talk about these issues. We've seen Destiny Church, I guess, disrupting the Pride March that we had in February here. We saw violence at a library drag event. And we are seeing different politicians, really challenging the legislation. So I think there's a bit of both. But I think what's important to remember is that DEI work, the first letter is diversity, and there has always been people who resist this work and don't agree with this work. And, we need to be able to listen to those people and hear their points of view and understand where they're coming from. Yeah.
Look, I'm just gonna say, like, how much of this do you think is a sort of a weaponizing and a popularizing of racism, misogyny, ableism, all of these isms? There does seem to be, I suppose, a legitimizing of some of those voices, or are those voices just the ones that make it to the top of the media pile? They say something outrageous, it leads the news, and people talk about it on the socials.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I think those voices were always there. You might, go to a family dinner and there is the typical uncle who
No,
comes out.
it's an uncle, eh?
It is always an uncle who comes out and says something incredibly offensive. So those people have already been there, but I think what the media is doing is taking, well, Trump's views and then going, okay, well, let's find those voices here in Aotearoa, and do they exist here? So yeah, it's really permission giving,
Yeah,
I think.
yeah. I wanted to how much of it do you think is a scramble for popularity? There's clearly there are votes to be had. When we look at it from a political thing, you're always going to have your destinies and others, they'll have their belief. But in that kind of political sphere where people can drive this kind of change,
Mm.
I'm going to say there are certain minor parties and they're all scrambling for a little bit of the same vote. And some of that vote comes from a very anti-DEI kind of thing. So if they stand up against it, that pushes them over the line.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I definitely think that's true. And we're not just seeing it here in Aotearoa, we are seeing it in other countries. You can probably tell I'm Australian, and we're seeing some of the same behaviours of politicians in Australia. There's an election in Australia this year, so we're hearing some of those messages thick and fast, which is interesting, perhaps also concerning.
Yeah, look at this. If we forget the politicians,
Yeah.
amongst ordinary folk, businesses that you talk to on a daily basis, is there a sort of a desire to continue their work in that DEI field? We've seen some other businesses, for whatever reasons, very publicly state that they're going to exit from their environments. How about
Yeah.
here?
I haven't I haven't seen it here, um, but I have been hearing where some organizations might be pulling back, maybe not going as hard on the work. Um, so I've heard a little bit of that, but nothing too much. The way I look at it, though, the organizations who are doing this work and who do think it's important, they're doing it because they want to be able to attract the best talent. They want to have businesses that perform really well. And so they know this is how to do it. So no matter what a president of the US says, organizations in New Zealand know the value and will continue to do the work, in my view.
Yeah. Hey, look, I'm curious around that, Lisa. Look, we've been through a period of quite low unemployment, and people really were looking for every advantage that they could find to get the best
Yes.
talent. Now that
Yes.
things are a little slacker in the employment market, do you get a sense that businesses will continue to really strive to provide the best environment so they can still nab the best talent?
Look, I think the top organizations, the market leading organizations will definitely continue to do that. I mean, no doubt there will be some organizations who'll take advantage of a loosening of the talent market and knowing that there's, more people out there for the jobs that they have. So, I think there's always organizations who will take advantage, but I think the ones um, that want to have good workplaces and want to have a strong organization will continue to do the work they're doing.
Exactly. So for those human resources leaders that are in their workplaces right now, and what's the impact on them at this point in time?
Yeah, look, I think being a HR leader, probably for the last 5 years has been super, super tough. Um, we had COVID, we had, making sure we look after the well-being of our people. We've had everyone working remotely, and it's felt like it hasn't let up. And now we have this backlash, supposedly, and so it's pretty tough. But for HR leaders, I think some of this work is, we've just got to keep at it. So HR leaders will be thinking about, are we are we in line with the legislation around our people? So in New Zealand, that's the Human Rights Act, which tells us what it's unlawful to discriminate on certain characteristics, things like sex, marital status, religious belief, and there's a whole range. Um, we have an Equal Pay Act that was written in 1972. There has been some amendments, but we still don't have equal pay in New Zealand. So there is a compliance piece for HR leaders that they will continue to work on. Um, and then on top of that is how do we create a great culture that people want to work at?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where do we sit globally with our legislation around this kind of thing? Are we Are we middle of the pack? Are we slightly ahead in some places or behind in others?
Well, that's a very tricky question because I don't understand all of the legislation in New Zealand. I would say from what I've seen so far since living here that the standard has been set. So there are words that say that we should treat people well and we should look after people. And just because you've got brown skin and you're Indigenous to this country, you shouldn't be paid any less than a white person in this country. So we have some of that value that's been established. I think the challenge is, and this is the challenge for many countries, including Australia, where I come from, is how compliant are we against that legislation? And in some ways, I don't know if I can answer that. It would depend on the organisation,
Yeah,
but we know for pay, as an example, we have a just under 10% pay gap across the board. So we're not compliant.
not at all.
No.
Look, for HR practitioners, for leaders who are sitting there as well, you know, for a long time, there've been this discussion of these nice to have programs, the importance of continuing to
Yeah.
have them as strategic and essential investments.
Yeah.
That conversation is still going to be ongoing, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely. And in some ways, I would recommend to organisations at the moment, or to HR practitioners, in fact, that get really focused. So, what are the strategic things you're doing that your CEOs, your managing directors will want to invest in? And the nice to have programs are great, but in a period of time where the economy's struggling and we have the media going, oh, this DEI stuff is rubbish, we should stop doing it, we need to get back and focus. So for HR practitioners, that's about what is the business case for D&I and how does it link to your organization strategy? So is your organization in an innovation space? Like, do you need to be coming up with new ideas? Is your organization trying to enter new markets? Are you trying to solve big problems? Like really knowing the business case versus what your organization is trying to do and be able to link that really closely. And then what are the moments that matter in your organization? So that's where decisions get made about people that could potentially be unfair. And what action do we need to take? So if we're recruiting people, how can we make sure the process is fair for everyone? When we're promoting people, how do we make sure the process is fair for everyone? So really coming back to the basics, but really getting strong alignment with what the business is trying to do.
How can HR leaders, what can they be doing to ensure that the executive leadership support is ongoing as well? In this time, I suppose, politically, culturally, financially, because
Oh,
there's pressures on all sides when it comes to this.
it really is. And I mean, I think in some ways it sucks to be a CEO at the moment. Like there's so many expectations put on you. But really, leaders in organizations, the things they do, say, measure has a huge impact on the culture that you create, right? Um, so in terms of being able to support leaders and influence leaders, there's a few things that I think about. One is meet leaders where they're at. So how are they feeling about this work? What are they seeing in the external market about DEI work? What's going well, what's not going well. Really understand their perspective. So this piece around, we've got people standing up now saying, look, I don't agree with this work. I don't think we should be doing it. But like really digging a bit deeper with our leaders and saying, well, tell me more about that. Why do you feel that way? And what's been your experience so far? But really being able to build relationships with the leaders in our organizations to do all that. And then I always think about, and it's something I talk about with HR leaders and DEI leaders, when you're thinking about influencing, make sure you have really good data that you can back up your arguments, have stories that you can tell that connect us as humans, and know how the people in your organization are feeling about this work and feeling about working at that organization. So having a real kind of data-led way of approaching leaders.
Yeah. What about, the classic, the water cooler and both here and in Australia, those barbecue conversations that you have with people? You must have had them, I'm sure. You
Yes.
must have heard people
Yeah.
railing against DEI. What in those kind of social situations, which in a way is probably quite good practice for going back to work as well.
Yeah.
Someone says, "Oh, it's bloody nonsense." What do you
Yeah.
say in that social situation?
Look, social situations are really challenging, particularly if you've had a couple of wines or a beer. Um, I tend to want to listen and ask questions because I know that if I start talking, I'll probably sound a bit defensive. So I usually say, "Oh, tell me why you say that." And sometimes I'll try and have a little bit of a debate at times and present evidence against the argument that they're presenting. Uh, yeah, sometimes I just shut up. because I work in this space all the time.
Yeah,
Sometimes you need a break at a
yeah.
social event, right?
Look, you do, and for people who are working in this space, probably now
Mm.
almost more so than, look, as you said at the start, we've had COVID and various other challenges, but this one's perhaps a
Yeah.
slightly different one because it's quite philosophical and it's very personal. How should those HR practitioners be taking care of themselves when it comes to dealing with all of the issues around the whole DEI? I'm going to call it a debacle because it has turned into
It is a
it's a
debacle.
debacle.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I often talk to DEI HR leaders about this. So here's the thing, people that work in HR roles, people and culture roles, are usually there because they care about people and they want to make organizations great places. So you're usually not all leaders, but often they're emotionally invested in the work. And then people who work specifically in DEI work usually have a really strong value around the work. So something's happened to them personally or in their family. And the work is really, really important. It's more than a job. And so when you are in value driven work like that, it is really hard when this stuff happens, when someone says to you, "Oh, this work is rubbish, I think we should just stop it." That's really upsetting because it's attacking your personal values in many ways. So I always talk to these leaders about, what do you do when things are tough? How do you step outside of it? What do you do to make sure that you mentally and physically are healthy and are going to be okay? I always remind people that this work is slow. It's culture change work and it takes time. So most days you might feel like you're not moving forward, and some days you feel like you're moving backwards. And that's normal. So really normalizing the stuff, and then have someone you can talk to. So have another person in your organization or another organization who understands, and that you can both have a chat about it.
Yeah. Look, it is slow work. Look, and it's culture
Yeah.
change in the midst of culture wars that happen after every pandemic. This sort of
Yes.
it's a sort of a cyclical thing. Do you have a go-to story that you bring up when you talk about this kind of thing? We say, well, look, here's a great example of something that I once saw that really sums it up. Because really, whilst we talk about this thing on this large political level, this is a very human thing. It's an individual thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I'll tell you a story. I did work with a chief people officer, and she would always say this work is about one conversation at a time, which I think really puts things into perspective. It's not like you're going to stand up in front of a group of people and tell them something and have them agree and believe it and do it. It doesn't work like that. But I did have, it was during 2020 when a man called George Floyd was killed in the US. A poor black man was killed by the police. And the organization I was working for at the time, the CEO took this situation very seriously, and had run some sessions with our black employees in the US. He'd spoken to 20 different individuals. Our CEO, it was amazing. And then the CEO, I didn't know he was doing this, but at one of the executive team meetings, or it was an extended leadership team meeting, so it had about 40 people in it, was talking about the conversations he'd had with our Black people and the impact this death had had on them and their families. And I was like, this is amazing. One of the executive team rang me and he said, Lisa, the CEO, he just spent 2 hours talking about Black Lives Matter. I'm like, I said, oh, that's amazing. And he said, but Lisa, people are worried about their jobs because we were in the middle of a pandemic. And at the time, we were looking at restructuring and what we were going to do with the organization. And I said back to him, but people are worried about their lives. And it was a very direct thing to say to an executive team member, but it was in the moment because I was quite frustrated that he was worrying about jobs and we had people who can't safely leave their house with the police not killing them, right? And that was a turnaround point for me with that leader, that then he wanted to come and work with me because I'd challenged him on something. And so I always think it's just that one-on-one, being able to understand someone's perspective, being able to push sometimes on someone's perspective and have that kind of conversation. And, I've implemented really large programs in organizations, but it's those moments that I remember.
Brilliant. Yeah, are you optimistic? Because you have to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there are people doing great work. There are people leading organizations who not only care about having a successful business, but want to make it a great place for the people who are there. So yeah, I'm optimistic about that.
Probably more important than ever that we celebrate those, those stories when we can and actively seek them out because, if you are in a business and there's a few of you and you're sort of feeling all of this pressure coming down, it's good to look out, say out the window and say, actually, there are some other people over there with the same kind of pressures and they're doing the same things and look what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. So what are you going to do with the rest of your day?
Well, this is a good question. I am prepping for running some leadership work for tomorrow.
Great. I'm sure there'll be a DEI component of that, I imagine.
There definitely is.
The work continues. Brilliant.
Yes.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa Mulligan from the Culture Ministry. So there we go. Look, if you've got any thoughts on DEI, if you need anyone to chat to and talk about all of the many pressures that are facing you at the moment in any of the particular HR fields, but certainly this one, do get in touch with HRNZ or indeed get in touch with Lisa. She's available. What's the website, Lisa?
It is www.thecultureministry.com. And you can also find us on LinkedIn. And any listeners who'd personally like to connect with me on LinkedIn, I would love that.
Great, we're connected now. Such as the
world. We are connected.
That's just the world we live in. Look, there, as many of the flaws as there are in this kind of modern world, there are some great benefits to it as well. Brilliant.
Yes.
All right. For now, from me to Rada, it has been another HR chat. Goodbye.